Welcome to the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies External Speaker Series. We're so excited that all of you could join us today. And we'll be recording this, so I hope you probably got some message that we're recording to our cloud, so thank you so much. We're delighted today to have Professor Maher, and in a moment, one of the lecturers from the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies, Veronica Brownstone, will be introducing him. I do want to say thank you so much for coming to this event, and I will I'll put in the chat momentarily for a link for you to visit our website to see some of the many upcoming events that we have this semester as well as next semester. And we'll be delighted to have you. And in fact, we'll be having a Center for Latin American Latinx Studies internal speaker series with Elizabeth Bynum, who is a music and anthropology PhD candidate, has done a lot of work in Mexico, on next Tuesday at noon. And so we're hoping, we hope you can join us for that. On November 30th, we'll be having two events related to Venezuela, and we hope you can join us for that as well. I am the people here in person, I've asked them to sign in and let me know if they want to join our listserv. But if you're interested in joining our listserv and you're not already, just feel free to write us at clousupenn@sas.upenn.edu. And my name is Kathy. I am the Associate Director of the Center for Latin American Latinx Studies. And I see our director here, Dr. Tulia Faletti as well, who's the director of the center. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Veronica Brownstone, who will be who's hosting Professor Maher today. Veronica is an interdisciplinary scholar of Central American cultural production, labor, and community formation. Funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, her research examines the politics and aesthetics of urban underemployment in the Northern Triangle and its diaspora, and more recently, arts and education programs in correctional facilities across the region. She's currently a lecturer in the Center for Latin American Latinx Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and she also just received her PhD not too long ago from the University of Pennsylvania in Hispanic Studies. So let's welcome Veronica. And you want to come up here? Thank you so much again, Veronica, for bringing such great speakers.
Hey, everybody. I just want to ask those on Zoom to please mute yourselves. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to everybody that's on Zoom. We're really, really happy to have Gio here. I want to thank the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies and the Political Science Department, specifically the Political Theory Workshop, for generously hosting him. So Maher is a Philadelphia-based writer and organizer and currently a visiting associate professor of global political thought at Vassar College. He has previously taught at Vassar College, San Quentin State Prison, and the Venezuelan School of Planning in Caracas, and has held visiting positions at the Decolonizing Humanities Project at the College of William and Mary, NYU's Hemispheric Institute, and the Institute for Social Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. He is co-editor of the Duke University Press series, Radical Americas, and author of 4 books, We Created Chavez of Duke 2013, Building the Commune of Verso 2016, Decolonizing Dialectics of Duke 2017, and most recently, A World Without Police. 2 new books of his will appear in early 2022, Anti-Colonial Eruptions of University of California Press and Spirals of Revolt of Common Notions. After the talk, we'll be selling some books on a sliding scale for anybody that's interested, and Gio will sign them for you, and we'll have a bit of time to chat afterwards. So he'll give his talk on policing prisons and abolition in Latin America, and then we'll have time for some discussion altogether. All right, with that, I'll give it over to Gio. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks to everyone who's on Zoom. I have the whole screen. I can actually see people that I know sort of on the Zoom screen right in front of me. So that's really nice. Feels warm and communal. Thank you so much for the sponsoring departments. Thank you to Dr. Brownstone for making this happen and inviting me. And thank you in particular for inviting me to talk about policing and police abolition in the Latin American context. Both because it's part of a conversation that I've been sort of trying to start with this book, A World Without Police, in which as I often argue, the idea of it being the world is a very serious one for me. And I'll get into what I mean by the world of policing in a couple of minutes. But also because Latin America has been hugely influential for me in the way that I think about policing. For those of you that know my work, you know that I began doing a lot of work in Latin America with popular revolutionary movements. And I was just explaining to some of the students here earlier about the fact that my very first book begins with me entering a sort of self-governed, armed, self-defended community in Western Caracas. And that being very formative for thinking through popular power, popular struggles across Latin America. And as I narrate it now in this book, thinking about policing in the US, which is often understood in a very US-centric framework, an abolitionist framework, for me, that kind of, the idea that both policing and abolition were something that would stop around the borders didn't ever make much sense. I was moving back and forth between Caracas and Oakland, of course, being the home of the Black Panther Party, which we should always call by its full name, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, right? Which sought to not only defend communities from police, but also to reconstruct communal fabric, not only patrolling, but also walking older community members to the bus to make sure that they're safe and creating the conditions for which police would be, in the title of the book, borrowing from Angela Davis, obsolete, not invited into the community, not necessary and irrelevant, to the functioning of that community. That was always a framework for me, thinking about the fact that, this question of policing and abolition was always a transnational one. And this book gave me really an opportunity to begin to dig into it. And today I'm actually going to be able to look even further beyond some of the things that I talked about in the book into some questions that I've been talking about this semester with my students at Vassar when it comes to thinking about specifically some Latin American contexts and Latin American cases. So that's also really exciting to be able to bring that to you all. Just schematically, when I talk about the world without police, this is always in reference to a world that we inhabit, which is a world of policing. Without spending too much time in the US context, I do need to sort of work my way through a bit of that context, because that's also the world that many of us inhabit. It's a world anchored in US histories, in a history of slavery, abolition, reconstruction, the failures of that reconstruction, which lead us to where we are today. As I often argue here, kind of tracking very closely Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois, it was out of the failures of abolition, namely the tearing down of an institution without successfully reconstructing that society from the bottom up, that we get the continuities that we see today. In other words, instead of true abolition, we got sharecropping, convict leasing, the criminalization of Blackness, mass policing, and mass incarceration. This is the fallout of an abolition that fails to build up society. And this was not, of course, without effort. The ambitious project of abolition that W.B. Du Bois calls abolition democracy, in other words, a radical multiracial society of equals, of economic equality and economic democracy, along with political democracy, was destroyed in blood and fire by the Klan and by the great betrayal of poor white Southerners that we name today the police. It was precisely in that process of being police, of policing slaves and then former slaves, that poor white people sold out their own class interest in favor of allying themselves in white solidarity with their own class oppressors. That's a huge part of the US history. And what we've seen ever since is the expansion of that world of police in multiple ways. We've seen it expanding, this is a notion of policing that's, of course, synonymous with whiteness from the very beginning, but which has since expanded beyond it. A world of police that incorporates many communities of color, or at least their most recognized political, religious, and otherwise spokespeople, incorporating them into the project of mass incarceration and mass policing, most notably with the Clinton crime bill in the 1990s. It's a world of policing that expands far beyond policing as an institution. From the very beginning, the police and the Klan were, as the popular phrase goes, hand in hand. And that continues today. We're literally amidst a trial of a white paramilitary terrorist named Kyle Rittenhouse. And, you know, this case is not an aberration. This is the history of policing. And it's the ways in which, you know, white people in particular have always been self-deputized police, even if they weren't policing, formally speaking. Ahmaud Arbery was not killed by the police. Trayvon Martin was not killed by the police, but they were all killed by self-deputized police, people who adopted and embraced and expanded this world of policing. The world of policing has expanded, you know, to spheres in which it never touched before, right? Education, police in schools, police in public libraries, police on transit. This is all new. And this is this process of this expansive project of a world of policing. It's important to understand that because it's not as if the police have always existed, first of all. And the first task of a historical materialist, of course, is to historicize and thereby dehistoricize certain institutions and understand the way that we can denaturalize and think beyond them. But also, even in recent decades, we've seen the dramatic expansion of police budgets, you know, the militarization of police, you know, the expansion into new realms of, you know, of military weaponry. It's important to understand that policing has never been contained, however, to the borders of the United States. And this is where we really get toward the meat of what I want to talk about today. First and foremost, the police and the border were also synonymous in many ways. It was precisely this process of formal and informal policing that pushed the border westward, that dispossessed indigenous people, that provoked a war of annexation, seizing Texas and the Southwest, and that then in an intensive process of dispossession, dispossessed Mexican Tejanos of their land. Here we're talking about the Texas Rangers and of course a whole range of quasi, you know, posse type paramilitary white organizations performing that role. Transnationally, of course, policing is a global phenomenon. This is increasingly recognized. And I could point people to lots of different directions, particularly to the work of someone like Stuart Schrader, whose Badges Beyond Borders tracks the way that policing and counterinsurgency are not newly fused, right? This is not a new relationship between the two, but the police and counterinsurgency forces, global imperialism have always been part of a broad process, to the point where policing is counterinsurgency and counterinsurgency is policing. And they're sort of mutually learning from and developing relationships and skills and tactics and repertoires in relation to one another. This is incredibly important today, right? Because we're not, you know, I think we're rightly scandalized to see tanks rolling through Ferguson, or just last year, tanks rolling up my neighborhood on 52nd Street. But to simply call for the demilitarization of the police is to misunderstand the historical function of policing, but also to misunderstand militarization as a relatively new phenomenon, which it is not. And of course, it need not be said, I think, that Derek Chauvin was not using military grade technology when he killed George Floyd. Policing is a transnational phenomenon embedded in US imperialism, global structures of hierarchy and power. And this manifests, of course, in interesting and different ways that have developed over recent decades. You know, starting, of course, with, you know, the Vietnam War being itself described as a policing action, right? But this is also a sort of framework for thinking through many other actions and many other forms of intervention. It looks both like open imperialism, right? Direct US involvement globally is a form of policing and premised on, you know, many of the same logics of policing. But it also looks like the way that US aid, for example, is tied to the building and development of police forces, you know, in other countries as a form of kind of outsourcing of policing itself, and specifically of outsourcing counterinsurgency. When the US government insists that foreign aid be used to build police, what it's saying is we want you to deal with these insurgent problems before they come to us, before they reach our borders, whether it's in Central America, Mexico, or even Palestine, which I think is a really interesting example, because we're not even talking about the Israeli police force and military, but we're talking about the Palestine police themselves, run by the Palestinian Authority, and lots of good research showing the very real counterinsurgent function that those police are also playing as part of the Oslo Accords, as part of the US you know, role in the region. Policing is a global structure. Latin America, I think, has a lot to tell us, both about the way that this global structure of policing works, but also about, you know, the ways in which we can glimpse and begin to glimpse different kinds of alternatives. Now, in the book, I mostly turn to Latin America. And one of my goals in this book, of course, is to introduce an expansive vision, to say abolition is global, to say that policing is global, and we need to fight back on that global terrain as well. And yet, this book was really just the beginning of that kind of conversation. And the question of Latin America and global South struggles is relatively limited even in this book. And there's much, much more that can be said. I mostly talk about alternatives, which I will speak of in a moment when it comes to Latin America. But part of what I want to talk about has to do with the very daunting challenges, I think, that looking at policing through the lens of Latin American politics and vice versa, looking at Latin America through the lens of police abolition, has to say. And some of these things, as I said, are things that I've been talking about with my students. And the first, of course, is the question of translating policing to a global level. And it's a complicated one. We don't want to insist when we say that policing is a global structure and therefore abolition is global. We don't want that to be a flattening framework that says, for example, all police in every place do the same exact things at all times. On the one hand, I think when you really get down to it, almost everywhere on earth, the police defend property and they defend whiteness. And I think that's true in many cases, even where we may initially feel as if frameworks of whiteness are not the most operative frames, right? If you think about, you don't have to look very far to find, for example, the profound anti-Blackness that emerges in policing in certain parts of Asia, maybe unexpectedly, maybe outside of our contemporary and normal historical frames of colonialism, to be reminded of these phenomena. On the flip side, however, we have questions of what exactly are the sort of contextual differences. And here, a question that I'll return to precisely has to do with the question of, say, Venezuela, right? Or the question of Cuba, which comes up very often. And what is it that we make of attempts to engage in policing in a revolutionary way, in a revolutionary context? As a beginning framing, what I want to say is that, the question is not simply of insisting on these all operating in precisely the same way, but of still insisting that the horizon of abolition has a great deal to tell us about, about how to contextualize the limitations of those experiments as well. And I'll give a couple of examples as we move through these questions. Now, first things first, I think, has to do with sort of locating ourselves, sort of narrowing down into the Latin American context and thinking about the broad historical parameters of these questions. Has to do with thinking about the way the police and prisons have developed over recent decades in Latin America. And again, this is super broad strokes. It's not sort of uniform, but we can say, I think, a few things. One is that, and here I want to bring in the sort of classic Foucauldian parameters of the shifts in regimes of power, because I think it's very illustrative when we talk about these cases. So Foucault, of course, posits this transition from sovereign power toward more, disciplinary forms, of power throughout history. Sovereign power being brutal, arbitrary, spectacular, and disciplinary power, taking different forms, but ultimately being, more isolating, being more individualized in certain cases, cultivating and creating new kinds of subjects in the process, and of course being gentler and softer and gentler, as Foucault acidly describes it. Of course, this is something that Foucault hates, and part of the question here is what kind of freedom is foreclosed with that kind of disciplinary power. Foucault's been, I think, widely criticized for being overly determinist, presuming that this historical transition was over and done with and complete. We know very clearly that even in the global north, this was not the case. As someone who used to teach at San Quentin, look around, there's a very old prison, of course, but still not that old. And it didn't take much looking around to realize that this was not a panoptical prison, right? It's actually a prison that's built on blind spots, built on, concealment, that, and that, of course, operates very heavily on the basis of sovereign, arbitrary violence and, and decision-making. This sort of panoptical logic and disciplinary power has never been fully inculcated and instantiated, even in the US, much less so in the global South and particularly in Latin America. One main reason, when you look at, I think, the history of these attempts to build, say, panoptical prisons in Latin America is precisely because it's expensive, right? There were reformers in Latin America. They wanted to build panoptical prisons in Venezuela and elsewhere. There's no money for it. These are incredibly expensive projects. And overall, the project of disciplinary power, I think, and here's one thing that Foucault misses in terms of a global framework, is an incredibly expensive project. It involves processes of individuation. It involves processes of identification, for example, of criminality. And it involves, in many cases, if we're thinking about policing, modern professionalized policing techniques that are very expensive and that are only very tenuously accomplished in even the richest of countries. That's, I think, the broad, overarching framework. What happens in recent decades? Economic disaster and neoliberalism. This has sort of, and we split it into the question of policing and prisons. On the level of prisons, you have a turn to what is often called self-governed, self-rule, prisoner self-rule. Many people have probably seen sort of sensationalistic accounts of this, where it's like, oh, the prisoners run the prison. And it's not quite that sensationalistic, but it's very much a reality, right? As neoliberalism withdraws resources from the state, as governments are struggling to cut budgets and are sort of forced to cut back on state, expenditures as a result of structural adjustment programs and economic crisis, there's definitely this turn across the region to prisoner self-rule, which means manning the walls and letting the inmates sort things out on the inside. There's a lot of great research into this, and particularly analyses of the way that prison social structures are established and reestablished, these sort of Bourdieuian readings of the cultures and hierarchies that develop. On the other side, you have, on the question of policing, a turn toward what's called mano dura or hardline or iron fist policing in many cases. And this takes a few different forms. On the one hand, a rhetoric of criminality and law and order, which we're very familiar with in the US, I think, but in a very important way. And again, cutting against the kind of Foucauldian analysis, you have this turn toward policing not individuals, but populations. Policing not criminality, but entire neighborhoods and barrios and regions. You have, instead of individual police identifying threats, you have checkpoints. You have disrupted territory and geography. And again, this is a sort of fiscally, enforced retreat from anything that looks like what Foucault would have envisioned disciplinary power looking like. And this mano dura policing expands, I think, across the region in the 80s and the 90s in particular. So the shifts in policing and imprisonment across the region in accord with these sort of neoliberal transformations, I think, are crucial. What does that mean? And again, these are the pieces that I'm just working through, again, with my students and like reading about, and we're all talking about, having these conversations about that are very interesting. But one very interesting, case that I want to raise is the case of prisoner self-rule, particularly in and around Sao Paulo in Brazil. Of course, a country where, per capita police massacre people. And so policing in Brazil is this whole other and crucially important question in terms of racial capitalism, in terms of the disintegration of any kind of professional policing. But starting a couple decades ago, you have this increasing influence of organizations like Primer Comando de Capital in Sao Paulo prisons, to the point where this organization, some call it a gang, but it's very much also a revolutionary organization, runs and manages many prisons, and sort of 90% of prisons in Sao Paulo. From a Foucauldian perspective, it's important, I think, to highlight the ways that sort of prisoner self-rule can mean and could mean a kind of psychic liberation, right? If part of what Foucault is so concerned about with disciplinary power is this inculcation and this sort of indoctrination, the fact that we become new docile subjects, this would seem to be the opposite of it. You've got like prisoners, establishing their own kind of societies, within prisons, even if it's a bit, certainly more dangerous in many cases. You've got something like a society of humans, of human contact, of human freedom on a certain level. But what you've seen, interestingly, and while you could make that argument, I think in some cases, and some inmates certainly feel that way, what's been very interesting is the fact that as organizations like Primer Comando de Capital establish their hegemony in these spaces, many of the sort of inmates begin to describe what feels like Foucauldian surveillance, discipline, individuation, and sort of the creation of subjectivities. And so it's this very interesting way in which even self-government, prisoner self-rule, when it becomes hegemonic, drifts toward doing precisely what it is that Foucault sees the state as doing as well. That's one, I think, very interesting case that shows the ways in which even, prisoner self-rule can lead back to, sort of our starting point that we're, very much concerned with. In Venezuela, you have both transformations of the prisons and of the policing system, I think, that are worth commenting on. Again, this is in the context of a revolutionary project that seeks to a sort of humanist vision of socialism and seeks to transform a society, in a whole range of structural ways. But very much, from the beginning with an attentiveness to questions of policing and mass incarceration. Police, the Metropolitan Police, when Chavez comes to power, are the most hated institution in the country. Ultimately, they would be abolished. Poor neighborhoods are demanding the police be withdrawn and the National Guard be sent in. That's how, violent and corrupt these institutions were. And so you have, again, this dual process of transforming prisons and transforming the police. Transforming Venezuelan prisons was very much a response to prisoner self-rule, and specifically to incredibly violent rebellions and riots and massacres that were happening within those prisons. And what you saw was a very, I think, honest, ambitious attempt to think about prisons as potentially humanizing institutions. Not only the provision of sort of socialist ideology, of socialist education, the ability to engage in creative and artistic projects within state prisons, within these institutions, to contribute in a certain way and to develop in a certain develop in a way that would prepare people for participation in a socialist society. These were all, I think, very clear and very sort of honest aspirations of this system. And yet when you speak to some of the inmates, many of them are also torn in the same way, I think, that you find the inmates in Brazil being torn. Some say it's great, it's better, they're better funded, they're better resourced, they're safer. Others say, what, we're more isolated. Others say this feels more like an American prison, which is a really sort of devastating thing for a socialist, prison to be described as. And so what you see is what Corey Fisher-Hoffman has described as dual carceralities, right? These two forms of carcerality kind of in competition with one another. And again, around the parameters of something like Foucault's sort of psychic freedom from disciplinary power, it's not totally clear where people come down, in terms of how they feel about them. When it comes to the police, again, there's an attempt, and this points towards some of the real cautions, I think, that the Latin American context provides for police abolition. There was a very, again, ambitious attempt to fully transform Venezuelan police, purge the sort of most corrupt elements, and to restructure policing on a basis that was, on the one hand, more centralized, on the other hand, fully educated and inculcated with revolutionary, humanitarian, socialist ideology, and to understand from the very beginning that crime and violence is the outgrowth of social inequalities. That was the starting point. And again, in no way do I want to, I think, downplay the honesty and the sort of authenticity with which many people sought to contribute to this task. Same with the question of the prisons. But I think it's also a good case because it really shows the limits of what can be done within policing, and shows that, I think, very, very clearly. Why? Well, there's a few questions. One is, even from the very beginning, purging police forces, trying to remove the most corrupt and violent elements, meant sending those elements back into society to do who knows what, to be more directly participants in organized crime and violence, to be private security guards, private police, to man the checkpoints of an increasingly segregated urban landscape. This doesn't necessarily solve the fundamental social problem. But the main problem was that in the context in which violence was continuing to be an incredibly pressing question, even from within Chavismo, from within the left, there were increasing calls for a return to precisely the same kind of mano dura or hardline policing that had led to many of the revolutionary upsurges that had brought this sort of revolutionary movement into power. And so there's this contradictory tension of how is it that you can deal with these questions? How is it that you can respond to them through the police? And this is where I think we really do hit the limits of the police as an institution. And I don't mean to sort of belabor the point, but it touches on this question of how to think globally, right? And part of, just to be absolutely straightforward about it, I don't think Venezuelan police do exactly what the NYPD does, but I actually think the limits of policing are visible in both cases, right? I don't think simply because you've got police operating under a socialist project, especially when they're doing so within a very capitalist society, in a society that's at war, trying to essentially build a new kind and a new vision for society, it's incredibly naive to think that the police themselves could overcome those internal limitations. And I think here as a sort of counter example are precisely the kinds of examples that I mentioned in the book. Because in the book, when I talk about policing in Venezuela, when I talk about sort of community power in Venezuela, I don't talk about the police, of course, because that shouldn't be the central framework. I talk about those armed, sort of self-governed, self-managed communities. I talk about the ways in which these emerged from the grassroots level, communities that took over themselves in the 70s and kicked the police out and haven't let the police back in since. Even in the context of the Chavista government, they chose to continue governing themselves. That's the reference point, right? Organic, direct expressions of community as the basis for building an alternative without police. And that's the same in the US as it is, in Venezuela. I talk about, parts of Mexico on the one hand in Michoacan, where you had the very rapid emergence of self-defense movements, autodefensas in and around 2013, where entire communities got together and pushed out the cartels and the police and the state, in part because the cartels and the police and the state were all part of the same thing, right? And deeply, mutually infiltrated. But I also talk about even more inspiring examples like Cheran in Mexico, where on the basis of a stronger foundation for indigenous community and indigenous culture, again, in response to, drug war, violence, local residents, again, pushed the police out and have been self-governing that community for the many years since. I talk about examples in South Africa, examples in Northern Ireland, and one of the, main, some of the parameters that we get and some of the sort of refinements I think that we get of abolitionist thinking when it comes to, switching our frame and thinking about struggles in the global South, is that on the one hand, I think we're able to overcome what at least I perceive in a lot of arguments for the police in the US, where you hear this claim that it's the most vulnerable communities that need the police. And I think it's really interesting to be able to flip this and say, I mean, this is true in the US as well, but to look at, sort of Mexico amid the drug war, or Venezuela in some of the most dangerous neighborhoods on earth, or in the middle of a, armed struggle in Northern Ireland, or, struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and say, how is this more vulnerable than what people have been going through in all these other contexts where they absolutely refused the police and chose to build something different? And it really reminds us, I think, that those most vulnerable communities are the communities that precisely are not being helped in any way by policing in the US either. And those communities that are in many ways most in need of something like abolition. As I mentioned earlier, though, I do want to sort of return to this incredibly daunting question of what it is that you do with the police after abolition. Again, when we think, and here's one of the main things I think that Latin America offers to our analysis, even if it's a bit of a somber note, is if we abolish the police tomorrow, there'd be 1 million unemployed violence workers in just the United States alone. And what do you do with them? I say that Latin America raises that question because this is precisely the reality that Mexico, much of Central America, that Colombia are all grappling with. The civil war in Colombia mobilizing tens of thousands of people, and the question of reintegration is an incredibly powerful difficult one. I talk in the book in the US context about the heavy overlap between police and organized white supremacists, 3%ers, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers. If you abolish the police tomorrow, you would have a huge number of Proud Boys. If anything, white nationalism in the US is held at bay a bit by the fact that if you're a cop, you don't need to be a Proud Boy. You already are sort of on the same team. And so that's one of the key questions that it raises. But again, and really just to wrap up so we can have a bit of a conversation, one of, I think, the most important and inspiring elements of thinking about policing, and specifically thinking about abolition globally, is that it provides us a reminder that, that we're not a global minority when it comes to these struggles. We're talking about a global majority against global structures of hierarchy. We're talking about the ability of abolitionist movements in the US, for example, to plug in, as they already have been with, with Palestinian struggles, with global anti-imperialist struggles, build on this long legacy of revolutionary anti-imperialism. Again, no surprise and no coincidence that the Black Panthers are building community self-determination, or referring to Black and brown neighborhoods as internal colonies, in a context in which they're building relationships with revolutionary anti-colonial struggles across the globe. That's the kind of global solidarity I think that needs to be, needs to be built, needs to be developed today. And of course, it raises the question of border abolition, because we're not just talking about abolishing the police, we're talking about abolishing ICE, which is a relatively, I think, easy and straightforward task. Even more ambitiously is the fact that we need to be talking about abolishing Border Patrol, which has a longer term legacy of policing the border. And ultimately, we need to be talking about abolishing the border itself. Fusing together these struggles, though, stitching them together and connecting them through the sort of conduits of strong communities here, abroad, Mexico, Venezuela, Northern Ireland, I think puts us in a much more powerful situation to think through not only what we're going through here, but also to really build a global majority for completely dismantling policing on a global scale. So thank you.
Right. I'm going to open it to questions. Kathy, do you want to let me know if anybody up there? Okay. All right. And I'm going to wait for this to turn on, but if anybody has questions here in the audience. Let's see. Okay, well, I'm just going to ask my question then. Okay, so Gio, my question is a little bit about, hold on, let me see if does this work yet? Yes, okay. My question is kind of related to your, again, yes, it works, okay. Is related to a little bit about the critiques around reform, because I find that when I'm teaching, mostly students tend to really want to put things into a large scale, of like, what is feasible, how do we convince kind of the people who are not easily convincible of abolition, let's say. But I'm thinking more specifically in terms of the context that I work on in Central America, and in terms of kind of more conservative Caribbean and Central American societies that are also very close to individual kind of like, or personal, intimate experiences with violent death and violent crime. And how do you kind of think in the terms that we do about transformative justice and rethinking, retribution and punishment to not harm people more, but to resolve, or a way of doing justice that doesn't cause more harm? How do you kind of have that conversation in different societies? I think your book does a really incredible job of kind of how you put it, like build it, or like cultural bridges that like kind of introduce us to different types of alternative community safety. And so how do you make those bridges with kind of different conceptions of punishment or jailing that are not necessarily, all the way abolition, but might be more closer to some reform, or maybe not? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think it's difficult to disentangle it from everything else that global policing is, right? What Central Americans are living today is, of course, the long-term knock-on effects of Bill Clinton's own border policies and deportation policies, and of course the sort of the general neoliberal disintegration of social fabric across the Americas, which I think is, we're really paying a huge price for, for those policies. I mean, that's been going on from the very beginning, right? NAFTA driving hundreds of thousands of Mexicans off the land into the north, right? That doesn't answer the question of, what to do. And I think, and I don't think it's an easy one, but on the one hand, we're also talking about communities that I know the police are not helping, right? And I'm thinking of accounts of people who have, for example, been targeted, been driven out of their neighborhoods in El Salvador or something, and the multiple number of times that on the one hand, they went to the police and received no help when they were being threatened, when they were being sort of blackmailed. And more often than not, the fact that doing so was itself incredibly risky because the police were embedded in, in organized crime. And so, I do think we're also talking about communities in which people know oftentimes that the police are not helping. And so, part of it is a reframing question, which is very operative in the US as well, because I think there's this assumption often in the US that deep down the police do make us safer. And what I go into kind of exhaustively in this book is that it's a lie from top to bottom. It simply is not true, but it's still used rhetorically to make us feel as if we couldn't imagine something different, right? Even if, and that's in part to say that we're not starting from the perspective of needing a perfect alternative to begin to have a conversation, because what we've got is trash, right? So we need to think of something that could be built, that could be developed as, as that kind of alternative. And I think it's very difficult to imagine in some context the rehabilitation and reconstruction of social fabric, right? That's been absolutely decimated and devastated. And, but again, I think my sense is that a lot of people you speak to, if you ask them if they thought the police were helping, I think it'd be very difficult to, to say yes.
Gio, thank you very much. Muchas gracias for the presentation. It was very interesting. I haven't read your book, obviously, but I'm very excited. I actually have a question. So you were talking about, for instance, 2 different communities in Mexico. I was wondering, just to make my question short, do you know if these events, say in Mexico, no, the 2 communities that you mentioned, are they in any way in dialogue with each other, or would they be considered, unfortunately, isolated events of how communities have taken back, say, not only from the police, but as you mentioned, the drug trafficking phenomenon that has been ravaging Mexico since Felipe Calderon was there. I was wondering if you know of how these communities, or not the communities, their actual situations are in dialogue with each other, and then naturally, if they're in conversation with any other situation that you were mentioning, say, for instance, in Brazil, or if Venezuela is telling us something specifically about, I don't know, how Mexico can be reacting about it. I don't know if there are any direct links that you have seen, or if it's just, unfortunately, that they are not talking to each other, and we have to still figure out how to try to make it work.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think there is a level of isolation, but at the same time, I do think as well that, I mean, the experiments that I'm talking about in Mexico in particular, they're aware of each other, right? These were simultaneous in time, right? You also have the so-called community police in Estado Guerrero. And these are all developing in time. They're all being criminalized by the state in similar ways. And so they're experiencing these, these phenomena together. But I think I would go a little further, which is to say, and this is something that, also been thinking about in the Mexican context, is the fact that the question of community self-defense is really a constant thread, going all the way back, of course, to the 1960s and the guerrilla struggles, particularly in Southwest Mexico, in the ways in which the question is always the question of the community. Why? Because on the one hand, capital needs to disintegrate that community power and or at the very least tap into it. And it needs to move communities around, disrupt them. You know, it needs to disrupt them to turn them into a market. It also needs to disrupt them to claim their resources. And in a certain level, especially we're talking about, you know, states like Michoacan, Guerrero, Oaxaca, that project of destroying community was never accomplished, right? And so these become hotbeds of communal struggles. We call them guerrilla struggles, but they're also struggles built on community fabric that has existed, right? That has been, you know, stable. This is precisely why counterinsurgency is an attack on community. And this is why so-called community policing is such a threat, because of what it wants to do is tap into the power of the community and disintegrate that power, right? Because it sees that power as a threat. You know, and here you can read like something like the Undercommons of sort of Moten and Harney is very much resonant with this source and this, you know, this power that needs to be destroyed and disintegrated. So that's, I think, the way that capital and the state often see this, is as something that needs to be, you know, destroyed. And as a result, I think there is this common shared frame. And that's why claims about sort of self-determination, self-defense, I think are so resonant. I think one of the difficult questions is, you know, for example, if we're talking about the auto defenses in Michoacan, they were in many ways not built on as solid of a foundation as some of the other experiments. They emerged incredibly quickly, had very rapid success, were targeted by the state and by the narcos for infiltration and disintegration, and were defeated kind of just as quickly, right? What does that mean? I mean, why is that, right? I mean, because you're talking about people who clearly have a conception of what it would look like to defend their communities, but who maybe don't have as long a history of doing that, or specific frameworks, in this case of Cheran, indigenous frameworks for, you know, making that a practice, a constant practice, a democratic, collective practice. So you do have these, I think, you know, contextual differences. I mean, and this is true, I think, across the hemisphere. In Venezuela, it's a lot of communists, right? It's a lot of guevaristas and other people from the armed struggle, but who develop a certain conception of what it would mean to take over territory, govern that territory, you know, in conjunction with kind of Marxian conceptions of dual power and, you know, and revolutionary territorial control.
Jorge, you had a question. Do you want to ask it or should I read it? Okay, Jorge, I'm going to read your question. Okay, so he says, I wanted to ask if you could say a bit more about gangs as a social movement. Do you consider them to be expressions against punitive governance and neoliberal capitalism? Is there something to be gained from thinking gangs as an organizational or community form to imagine new transformative social relations? I work on similar stuff, so I have similar questions for you, Gio.
Yeah, no, we were talking about this earlier, and I know Jorge, of course, knows more about this specifically in the Central American context than, you know, than I do. But we were also talking earlier about the fact that, you know, in the desolation of sort of Salvadoran politics, right, there's this moment of a possible sort of direct conversation and ceasefire between certain armed, you know, groups, territorial gangs that, you know, provided a lot of promise, or at the very least some promise. I think the way you phrase it makes it very difficult, right? Because, you know, the question of whether or not gangs represent an alternative to punitive capitalists, you know, whatever, it is a question about positive content, right? I think what many street gangs offer is an alternative form of power that does already exist, and is more understood maybe as a means than as already containing that, you know, that positive content. And this is precisely when, for example, the Black Panthers engage directly with, you know, with gangs. They're doing so as a way of revolutionizing, right? Taking that mechanism and making it more revolutionary. Of course, if you go back to, and people that haven't seen, you know, films like Bastards of the Party, I definitely recommend you watch that. It's a history of the Bloods and Crips in South Central as emerging out of revolutionary self-defense against white supremacist terror. And so that's important to understand. But at the same time, what was required and what is massively, you know, even more required today would be to provide that, you know, that vision, that alternative, that transformative capacity, take those very real territorial institutions that gangs represent and turn them, right? Flip them, you know, toward revolutionary ends, toward community ends. I think it's very difficult to find, you know, a gang that has zero relationship with a community, because they are built in a certain kind of way. But at the same time, in a context of total devastation, in a context of the sort of hyper militarization of these communities that occurred in the 90s, in particular, you know, capitalism wins out, right? You know, and they, you know, they tip toward, you know, being sort of violent capitalist institutions.
Are there any other questions here or on Zoom? Yeah, Kathy.
Oh, I mean, you might have answered this a little bit. I guess I have two questions and it's sort of more, I may be pragmatic. This is amazing and I'm excited to read your book. I mean, this morning I was listening to the New York Times, the Daily, and they had a moderate Democrat from Virginia talking about, which I think she agrees that there should be a change in the police system. But what's your recommendation, again, in using discourse, to change the police, to abolish the police, if you're somebody running, in today's politics? And I mean, this is more US centric, but
yeah, I mean,
and then my other question, one other question I have is I teach classes on international organizations and the OAS and the UN. But so I guess, I don't know if you address that in your book, like what can, because it seems very bottom up, but do you think there's a way for like the OAS or the UN to address, within their security policies, this change?
I mean, they're both very difficult in the same kind of way, right? Which is because the premise on this question, on what level are these changes able to come through existing institutional channels? My general framework for understanding the world, right, going back to sort of the role of grassroots movements in Venezuela and elsewhere, is that change is that we cannot neglect institutions, but change comes to them and through them only when it becomes mandatory as a result of movements on the grassroots level, right? This is what happened last year in the streets here, right? We're only talking about police abolition because of what happened. There was only a ballot measure in Minneapolis about dismantling the police because of the power in the streets. And so in many ways, the institutions are sort of effect, right? They're not the cause, they're not the source. And we need to, I think, understand them in that way. I think, at the same time, I think, especially given people are talking about the failure of the ballot measure in Minneapolis. I mean, I think 43% voting for abolishing the police is a pretty huge accomplishment. And I also want to remind people that this ballot measure was artificially delayed for a full year, and that the past year has been just constant pressure from the media apparatus telling us, oh, crime is going up, oh, this, oh, that, we cannot afford to dismantle the police. We must continue to fund the police. We can't defund them. And so we've been essentially, scared away from the sort of big dreams that were being dreamt a year ago. But at the same time, I say it in part to say, the ballot measure nearly passed, right? It's possible for municipalities to start, engaging in these questions. For me, it starts in practice. Again, it starts from closer to the movement level, right? It starts from, on the one hand, building organizations in local communities, building connections between those organizations, connections with some local nonprofits, that have been developed to intervene and prevent, community violence. And it also means leaning on and pushing and attempting to sort of counteract existing institutions, right? Whether it's defunding, pressuring cities to defund, or weakening, the Fraternal Order of Police and other sort of fascistic police organizations, pushing back on their power and attempting to break that power. What you find when you try to change things institutionally, often, aside from the question of can you get a majority on board, is often the fact that, again, in the case of Minneapolis, the police were written into the city charter. So the charter had to be amended, which was how the delay happened for an entire year. In Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, there's a state law that requires cities to, negotiate directly with the police salaries and have binding sort of, negotiations. All of these things are the ways that the police ensconce their own power and sort of wrap themselves around, into political institutions, embed themselves. And that's very difficult to extract. But those are the kind of things that can, happen, right? Repealing all law enforcement officers' bills of rights, which are these state level laws that give special rights to police. And this is something that comes up. A lot of states have raised the question of possibly repealing these. The Pennsylvania law, there's been a conversation about possibly repealing it, and there are great organizations working on that. And those are all things within and in relation to existing institutions that can be done. The real force, though, I think, comes from, from the grassroots. I mean, Harrisburg is not going to repeal that law unless it feels that it has to, right? Because there's a full chorus that's constantly, the sort of police rights chorus, and the, the Blue Lives Matter chorus that's always in their ear as well.
I'm kind of thinking through, going back to Jorge's question a little bit. there was a period in Central America in the late 1990s after street gangs started to form, that anthropologists refer to the pandillas as pandillitas.
Mhm.
And that was a period also where it was kind of a transition from class politics to a more kind of like necropolitical, like non-classed group identity. And what I mean by that is that at one point, street gangs or maras were defending people from their communities, right? It was very much still something of our community versus the state,
Mhm.
right? And now the way that anthropologists write about it is that transition towards maras being completely non-discriminate in terms of, attacking their own, let's just say, or, in like fighting within the same class. In fact, they all pretty much share the same histories class-wise. And so how do you see like class consciousness or class formation in this? Or is it beyond, are we shifting towards like a different kind of identity group formation, or how?
Oh, I see.
The question is sort of about community formation and where that fits into this.
That's a great question.
Especially, in a context of where we're pretty fresh out of class warfare.
Mhm. What I think is interesting is that, I think you've seen this depoliticization in a lot of ways across these organizations. I said this happens in South Central in the 90s. It's also a project of the state, right? The state does not want these to be class conscious revolutionary organizations, right? The state, and this is why Mike Davis refers to the Bloods and the Crips as the bastard offspring of the Black Panther Party, because the CIA and the FBI and the entire COINTEL program comes in, beheads the political leadership of this potentially revolutionary movement, and leaves it depoliticized in a certain sense, and then actively depoliticizes it by pumping huge amount of drugs, weapons, militarizing the community, making it an object of counterinsurgency. And I think that's a project of the state, right? At the same time, you've seen a similar trajectory in Mexico, right? Even if we're talking about the cartels, right? Which were far less brutal prior to the new emergence of the drug violence, in the 2000s. A lot of that has to do with U.S. border policy. A lot of it has to do with the closing off of certain paths, the centrality of the Mexican trampoline to crossing the border. And it also has to do with the fact that, drugs, for example, used to pass through Mexico before arriving in the US, but now are being, of course, disseminated. And, that territorial question is being raised. What's, I think, difficult, especially if we're talking about Central America, and here, I think, it was actually only recently that it really dawned on me how little, for example, these organizations have in common with cartels, right? These are pandillas. These are not cartels. These are tiny, yet they don't make any money. They barely make a salary, on most levels. And yet, are absolutely devastating communities precisely in search of that rent, right? And, the ability to sort of find profit wherever is possible. The landscape is absolutely devastating. At the same time, in some ways, it also points toward the ability, they've territorialized because of that, right? And it points toward the ability to regenerate community as well, precisely because we're not talking about something that's abstracted and away from communities. We're talking about something that's existing and occurring precisely on the lowest of levels. And again, not for a great deal of resources. What is it? Honestly, but like, here's a sort of more macro question. Like, what does it tell us about the state of social welfare in El Salvador, for example, that people are willing to be full-on members of Mara's devastating communities for $5,000-$10,000 a year, right? It means that there's zero community in terms of social welfare support, in terms of an actual sort of functioning state. And that, I think, again, I keep coming back to that question of, but again, it points, not to be optimistic about these questions, but it points to what, in a way, what little would have to be done, I think, to reclaim that territory, as compared to, I think, some other contexts. But the fact of the territorialization of this is precisely the question, and I think that's really a good one.
Are there any other questions on Zoom? Kathy, you want to get in quick check?
Oh, somebody has their Seneca.
Yeah, Seneca.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. I am absolutely loving this conversation, and the questions have been extremely generative. And I would say, not exactly piggybacking off, but sort of like inspired by some of the last three questions that came up. If perhaps Gio could speak a little bit, particularly about those policed populations. I think we can agree that the policing of populations is something. Oh, wait, hold on one second. Sorry, teenagers. The policing of populations is something that is both expected of a modern civilized state, you know, all inverted inverted commas, but and also as a means particularly of sovereign nations that have a history of US imperialist interventions as a sort of proof or or a protection from interventionism. I'm specifically talking about Venezuela as an example. We know that very recently, part of their initiative, for example, to decriminalize sex work was applauded. When we think of, you know, decriminalization as part of local and transnational abolitionist movements, and what populations either within a nation state or also globally tend to be sort of like those frontline communities that are long histories of criminalization that are absolutely tied with the nation state, with who is civilized, who gets to, you know, who gets to be good neighbors, et cetera, and how that changes at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. So sort of like in the examples from Venezuela, from Mexico, from El Salvador, and even maybe from the United States, what populations which have historically been hyper-criminalized across class and across race, but that sort of joined differently in this abolitionist movement, and particularly as it relates to sentiments of abolition, right? Not just thinking about sex workers, but also people who use drugs, and how in this country that those people have been on the forefront of abolitionist movements as categories of people, categories of people who are sort of leading that kind of reimagined radical imagination. I don't know if that was very clear, but that's basically my question.
No, it's a great question. Thank you so much, Seneca. And it raises the colonial question in a lot of ways, right? Because in which again raises the sort of caution that I was saying at the beginning about, you know, not thinking that militarization is the problem, right? Militarization post September 11th of the police is a massive problem, right? The 1033 program, which diverts billions of dollars of, military weaponry into the hands of police, huge problem. Again, policing doesn't require military, weaponry to do its work. And as I always like to point out, Bull Connor had tanks specially built to police the civil rights movement, right? What does that mean? It means certain populations are always seen as insurgent populations. Again, these are the same populations that then turned around and said, you know what, we're internal colonies. And if you look at the sort of phenomenological description of colonialism that Fanon offers in The Wretched of the Earth, what are you talking about? It's a Manichaean division of society between the colonizer and the colonized space. That's, that division is upheld, as he puts it, by the military and the police. You don't need to go far into West Philly or North Philly to realize that, of course, the way that the police function to divide and segregate space, is precisely, a colonial relation. And here, and to get to the question, what that delimits precisely is the fact that these are insurgent communities, right? And when they act together and act in conjunction, they're seen as insurgent movements. James Baldwin said when he described Harlem as occupied territory, he said the police not only see the population as an insurgent population, but they're looking at the rooftops, waiting for sniper fire. Why? Because the framework and the lens is precisely a lens of colonial occupation that policing inherits directly from colonial, struggles. All, police forces being designed directly on the foundation of colonialism. What that means for other communities, I think, is precisely part of the question. And I think you're very right to point toward not only colonized communities, right, but also I want to say sexual minority communities, but also sex workers, but also homeless people, but also drug users as being, brought into the frame of this. And it's in part precisely because of the way that policing is always about, dangerous communities as well. And this, is a broader category than insurgent communities, and it involves moral danger, moral panic. It involves the role of, for example, vice squads historically to break up spaces of solidarity, right? So as, police are heavily policing, former slaves in the South, they're disrupting spaces of sort of cultural and, interracial, community and intimacy between different people, different communities in South Central as well. This was an explicit project of white supremacist police chief Parker in LA, was to destroy the South Central music scene through the use of vice squads. Why? Because it was a space where sex workers, intimacy, transracial intimacy, people were coming together, people were culturally building solidarities that I think were a massive threat. When you go back to the history of whiteness, right, in the United States, a lot of it emerges from what we call Bacon's Rebellion in the late 1600s, which was precisely a moment of transracial solidarity, for the most part, between white, and Black workers, that scared the shit out of Virginia planters. And it was in reaction to that solidarity, in reaction to that community, that whiteness is born as a mechanism to divide these struggles. So I think anytime those solidarities emerge, then we see, the impact of it, right? And it's, here I'm like thinking about, political prisoners coming home, David Gilbert and Maroon Schultz and others, and David Gilbert in particular is someone who is punished precisely for the solidarity he showed to the Black Liberation Army as a white man, right? And has been in prison, ever since, until, just a couple of weeks ago. So.
All right. Does anybody else from the Zoom audience have any questions? Does anybody here have any questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Gio. Thank you so much.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you
much.
Everybody for participating.
I think there's tamales over here. So
We have some tamales if you want to take with you, and some books for sale at a sliding scale, and for Gio to sign and chat with you all. All right. Thank you.